Hello everyone and welcome to Archaeoviking. Today's video is a video about one of the first, if not the first, um, Indian wars in the southeastern, what would eventually become the southeastern United States. And it's a war that, while shorter than many of the others that would come after, was very influential on colonial politics. And technically it's two different wars, but one was a continuation of the other, as we'll get into. So these are the Tuscarora War and the Yamasee War, and the decline of Indian slavery, leading to the rise of African slavery. So who are the Tuscarora? Well, the Tuscarora were a tribe that during the 15 through early 1700s CE or AD, depending on how you want to measure it, lived in North and South Carolina, right around this area here, along with the Catawban and the Siouan, not to be mistaken for the Sioux like Lakota. Croatoan, Creek, and Cherokee. And they were one of the most powerful tribes in the region, rivaling that of the Catawba, Creek, and Cherokee. And they lived here for centuries after migrating from the Upper Great Lakes, as they were actually an Iroquoian-speaking language. Iroquoian-speaking people. Now, I should be clear that Iroquois is a slur and is not the preferred term of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which consists of, 6 tribes right now, but the original 5 being the Seneca, Oneida, Onondaga, Mohawk, and the other one is escaping me, and I apologize. But they prefer to be called the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. But the Tuscarora migrated and lived here for centuries. And of course, eventually they came into contact with Europeans in the 1600s and 1700s. And it was, well, it could have technically started with, the lost colony of Roanoke, but it officially started with the explorations and surveys done by this individual over here on the left, John Lawson, who came to this area because he essentially wanted to start his own colony, make a lot of money and such, and he put out a advertising campaign in the early 1700s, talking about how great the Carolina country was, and saying that people should come and travel here. And this eventually led to the creation of originally one colony just called Carolina, but eventually being divided into 2 different colonies, North and South Carolina, with John Lawson being personally responsible for the founding of several new cities, including New Bern and New Bath, right here in modern day North Carolina. And his campaigns worked. People flocked here by the thousands, thinking that the Carolinas were something they weren't. They didn't realize the Carolinas are, densely forested on the far western sides, but swamp and beachland and such on the eastern side. So it wasn't as fertile as they expected. But they came here anyway and began to settle. And with that settlement, first came trade. The Tuscarora enjoyed the trade, and they, because they got guns and new kinds of metals, because they did have metals before, copper and bronze and such, but they weren't as hard as stone, and while being sharper, didn't last as long. So they got steel, fabrics, and other European goods, which they traded in exchange for deer furs and other goods that they possessed that the colonists wanted. But eventually, this began to sour with further expansion, which led to further swampification of the land due to heavy industry from the Europeans and increased environmental heat and such, as well as over farming of the land and a variety of other things that led to um, a lot of diplomatic issues, we'll say. But the biggest issue that the colonists brought with them was Indian slavery. While African chattel slavery would eventually take over, the first type of slavery used by Europeans in the Americas was Indian slavery. And what they would often do is they would pay other tribes to go and attack their rivals and take captives from the territory of their rivals and sell them off to Europeans. This does not at all justify what they are doing, and it was still a horrible practice, but it is what they did. And eventually, with the expansion of the slavery and the expansion of colonialism, the Tuscarora began to show a lot of discontent. And the reason is because a lot of their population was being taken as slaves by the South Carolina colonists. So eventually, South Carolina and North Carolina's Tuscarora tribes began to attack the colonists in droves. Specifically, it was the Southern Tuscarora. The Northern Tuscarora stayed relatively neutral, but Southern Tuscarora under Chief Hancock gathered together their forces and began raiding the South Carolina and North Carolina colonies, especially North Carolina, and killing a lot of North Carolina officials, including John Lawson. They executed John Lawson and all these North Carolina executives, and then proceeded to go on the warpath. And as you can see here, this is the division right here. These are the Southern councils, and up here are the Northern councils of the Tuscarora. The Southern councils were the militant groups, while the Northern councils were the neutral groups, for now at least. And North Carolina suffered greatly under the Tuscarora attacks, as the Tuscarora were very united, understandably, under the belief that the colonists should not be here and should not be taking their people as slaves at all. And they gained quite a lot of victories. And in fact, they began to build various forts, such as Fort Nihohoroka, which was the best of the forts, but there were several of them. And these forts were actually, as archaeological evidence has discovered, just as sturdily built and just as well thought out as European forts. They were very well defensible and could take a lot of damage take a lot of punishment without being completely destroyed. So this gave them an edge, because whenever South Carolina and North Carolina colonists and militias began marching into territory and the Tuscarora felt they couldn't stand up to them in an one-on-one fight, they could flee into these forts and wait them out, which happened often, just as often as they scored victories. And part of the reason the Tuscarora were so successful in attacking the Carolinas, especially North Carolina, is because of an event called Carey's Rebellion. Essentially, about a year or so before, an individual by the name of Carey decided, Gabriel Carey, I believe his name, but I could be saying the wrong name. No, John Carey. I see the letter and the name in the bottom corner right there. John Carey felt he should be the governor of North Carolina. And so he started a rebellion over it. And eventually he was put down by the North Carolina governor that you see here. But because of this rebellion, North Carolina was severely weakened. So in response, North Carolina asked for aid from South Carolina. And South Carolina responded by sending in Colonel John Barnwell with, I believe it was about 30 colonists and over 500 allied American Indians that included the Muskogee, also known as the Creek, the Appalachee, the Yamasee, etc., with him. And he scored some victories, but so did the Tuscarora, and really he didn't gain any ground. He couldn't take any of the forts at all. The only time he really even succeeded officially is when he chased a group of Tuscarora into Fort Neohoroka and laid siege, and then of course nothing came of it, and eventually the Tuscarora gave up hostages and sort of told him to leave and said, we'll declare a truce right now and you can leave. And he did. But the attacks continued. And they continued for several years. And the part of the reason for this was because South Carolina had also been weakened by a disease known as yellow fever, which caused a lot of things like diarrhea and various other things, and basically just left the North Carolina and South Carolina colonies in a very weak state. Yellow fever was actually one of the worst diseases you could get at the time, along with smallpox and such. However, eventually, North and South Carolina would make a comeback. They called on Colonel James Moore and made him commander-in-chief of the colonial militia. And so he gathered around 100 militiamen and over 1,000 allied American Indian soldiers or warriors, which included not just the Muskogee Creek and the Yamasee and the Appalachee and such, but also the powerful Cherokee tribe. And so, because of this, he was able to eventually defeat the Tuscarora in various sieges, including at Fort Neohoroka. And the reason for this is because while these forts were incredibly well constructed and were actually much more defensible and much more advanced in many ways than European forts, the Tuscarora had no cannons to supply these forts. So essentially, while it did work originally that you could flee into these forts and hide out in the sieges and live to fight another day, under a concentrated siege with heavy cannons, with no cannons of your own to fire back at the opponent, they began to fall quickly. Also, an important factor was the once neutral northern Tuscarora tribesmen were no longer neutral. They had came in on the side of Colonel James Moore because he offered them lucrative trade deals and other things like that. And so Tom Blount was able to come in and add onto that 1,000 allied American Indian warriors. And in fact, during these sieges, Chief Blount was actually able to capture and kill Chief Hancock, therefore taking away the leadership of the Southern Tuscarora. So with that, the Southern Tuscarora at their defeat decided to return, well, not return, they decided to migrate north to their ancestral home, or at least where they may have originally come from before they migrated into the Carolinas centuries before they came into contact with Europeans, and eventually joined the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, but again, that's a slur. So what was originally the Seneca, the Cayuga, which is the tribe I was forgetting earlier, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawk now became 6 tribes, including the Tuscarora. So instead of being the 5 nations, they became the 6 nations, which actually the the Haudenosaunee had done before with various other tribes, but they had been subservient tribes. But the Tuscarora actually became equals. So not only did they strengthen the tribe like they had before, they strengthened the Haudenosaunee Confederacy more than other tribes had in the past. And the Tuscarora would eventually, in the Oneida, would eventually play, in fact, all of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but the Oneida and Tuscarora would play a key factor in helping the colonists in the American Revolution eventually. But as I said at the beginning of the video, this was not the end. Relatively shortly after this, in fact, almost immediately, several months later, several months to a year-ish, give or take, the powerful Yamasee tribe to the south was able to gather an alliance of various tribes, including, the Hitachi, the Muskogee, the Catawba, and the Cherokee, and begin an attack on the Carolinas of their own. And the reason for this is because with the defeat of the Tuscarora, these tribes, including the Yamasee, began to realize that they would now become the target of these slaving expeditions, or they might. There was no necessarily guarantee, but they were more likely to become a target of the slaving expeditions by the Carolina colonists. So in response to this, all of these tribes formed a confederation, the Appalachee, the Hitachi, the Muskogee, the Catawba, the Yuchi, the Cherokee, etc., and began a preemptive strike on North and South Carolina, destroying the area of the colonies to great effect. Attacking various towns like Charlestown, and winning battles like the Battle of the Ponds and Salicanachi, etc. And I don't know if I don't remember if they necessarily won the Battle of the Ponds itself, but you get the idea. They won quite a few battles. And it seemed that they were on the cusp of winning, but something changed. And that change was the Cherokee, in a similar way that the Northern Tuscarora were just a couple years before, were offered a better deal by the colonists than they were getting in the Confederacy. Also the Catawba as well, but especially the Tuscarora, especially the Cherokee. The Cherokee were, along with the Muskogee Creek and other tribes like the Chickasaw and Choctaw, were one of the most powerful tribes in the region, if not the most powerful, along with the Creek. And they switched sides to the colonists, along with the Catawba, therefore turning the tide of battle and severely defeating, alongside the colonists, the Yamasee, and breaking apart the Confederacy. So, and another factor to bring up is the fact that during this time, thanks to the Tuscarora War, in the first year of the Yamasee War, Britain decided to phase out militia and bring in professional soldiers. So these professional soldiers, being more trained and disciplined than the militia, were able to win more strategic battles than the militia had been in the Yamasee War and the Tuscarora War. And then, of course, with the help of the Cherokee and the Catawba. So with this defeat, the Yamasee were forced further south into along with the lower Creek, the lower Muskogee tribes. However, there were various tribes that were still left, as you can see in this colonial map, where you can see these various different tribes, such as the Chickasaw and the Nafue, etc. So basically, because of the defeat of the Yamasee and the Tuscarora, the entire balance of power in the region had completely changed in just a matter of a couple of years in South Carolina, leading to the Catawba and the Cherokee rising to prominence in the area where the Yamasee and the Tuscarora had once held prominence, as well as, of course, the Lower Creek, but though the Creek already had, well, they kept their prominence. Also, another side effect of this was the Lower Creek, the Lower Muskogee, and the Yamasee, who had been defeated by the South Carolina colonists and were forced further south, eventually fused into a new tribe called the Yamacraw. And this was brought on by a Muskogee chief named Tomachichi, who had been part of this alliance and had actually helped bring the confederation of the Yamasee and the other tribes about. And of course, now he had lost a great deal of power due to this defeat. But with this defeat came a new opportunity. As he created the Yamacraw and went into the area that is now Savannah, Georgia, he met Mary Musgrove, a Creek interpreter and tradeswoman, merchant, and through her eventually met James Oglethorpe, and together the three of them eventually led to the creation of the colony of Georgia. And I've already done a video on that, and I will link it in the iCard. I guess it's a fascinating story in itself. But one of the most lasting impacts, however, of the defeat of the Tuscarora and the Yamasee was the slow transition from the slavery of American Indians to the slavery of Africans, because Indian slavery was now distrusted due to the various wars and rebellions. And so now enslaved Africans looked far more lucrative and began to proliferate very quickly throughout the colonies. Of course, these would eventually lead to rebellions in themselves, like the Stoner Rebellion and such, which I plan to do videos on later. But and they certainly had their effects on the development of like the idea of servile insurrection, but it wasn't quite the same. In fact, they began to ship African slaves into the Americas in larger quantities than Indian slaves were ever shipped out of the Americas. So with this, again, a whole new paradigm shift had happened practically overnight. And then also important to note, another paradigm shift that I've already done a video on is the Cherokee began to adopt new tactics to fight the Europeans, because they had fought in the Tuscarora and the Yamasee wars and had seen how forts weren't necessarily the answer. They had seen that, yes, these forts that the Yamasee and the Tuscarora built were very advanced and could withstand a lot of punishment, but they could never withstand a concentrated siege due to the lack of cannons. So the Cherokee developed a strategy of flee or guerrilla warfare, where they would abandon their villages for the woods and oftentimes burn their villages, though often they would just leave them to be burned because they could rebuild. And they would use guerrilla warfare and ambush tactics to defeat and fight the Europeans. Now, of course, this wasn't a new tactic. This had been a tactic that had been used by tribes before, and by American Indian tribes before, but this was still this was an upgrade of the tactic. This was like the tactic 2.0. This was concerted versus traditional tribal warfare. They were using plans, attack plans, and such to do these coordinated attacks. And I've already done a video on that as well, the Anglo-Cherokee War. So I'll link that in the card as well. So there you have it. while they were very brief and only lasted a couple of years themselves, the Tuscarora and the Yamasee Wars were so brutal and so costly to the colonies of North and South Carolina. Professional armies were used to replace militias that had once been the primary form of protection. Indian slavery, which had been the primary form of enslavement in the American colonies, was done away with and replaced with African slavery. And new military tactics were adopted by tribes such as the Cherokee and the Muskogee to battle the Europeans in new, more successful ways. Furthermore, because of these defeats, new tribes such as the Iroquois began to develop, or old tribes became much more powerful, like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and new colonies were formed with the help of the veterans of these wars, such as the colony of Georgia, with the help of Tomochichi, a veteran of the Yamasee War, and a powerful Muskogee Creek chief. So with that, I'm going to leave the video. Soon, I will be doing a video on another very important war in America's history, the Cherokee American War, which is the longest war that the U.S. has ever fought with any American Indian nation. And so I hope you enjoyed the movie. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any subjects that you'd like me to cover in the future, feel free to comment. And I hope you all have a good day.